This week, we're going to still use the color wheel, but we're thinking about it in a different way. We're going to talk about color harmonies, sometimes called color schemes, color categories. We can agree on nothing. But we're going to call them color harmonies, and it's basically when an artist deliberately selects part of the available colors and uses it for expressive means. And we want to remember the for expressive means part. A thing that I would like you to take away from this is not only the definitions for the various color harmonies, but the fact that they come after the fact as descriptors. We're going to describe what an artist has done. Rarely does an artist wake up in the morning and decide to create a work using a specific color harmony just to illustrate my slide talks. And if they do, they're probably a bad artist. So what we want to remember is the way in which we use these to describe what is happening in an artwork and not necessarily think of them as rules that we have to follow. A monochromatic image is one that has all of the colors in a single hue category on the color wheel. So we can still have variation because of the properties of color that we talked about before. I can have lights and darks in one hue category. I can have warms and cools within the limited range of that hue category. I can have bright and dull colors within that hue category. So when we're looking at this Mark Tansey painting, which is a blue-green hue category, a monochromatic image, we can see the obvious variations in value. We've got lights, we've got really darks. Harder to pick up on, perhaps, are the variations on temperature. But if we look at her leg, see how it's just barely a little bit more yellow than, say, the blue-green behind her. And that's part of why, one, she doesn't look dead, and two, it makes that yellow come forward a little bit, or the warmer temperature makes that color come forward a little bit and makes it seem like it's closer to us. Similarly, we have more intensity in some of the colors that are closer to us and more saturated, and then things get grayed out a little bit in the background. Why does an artist want to create a monochromatic image? Well, one, it's automatically unified. All the colors are going to look good together because they're all the same color. This is why all the cool goth people dress in black. It always looks like it belongs, even if their souls don't. What we can also see with a monochromatic image is that it might have associative meaning, and that's part of what Mark Tansey is picking up on. He's creating this painting in this sort of blue-greenish monochromatic color harmony because of the way in which it refers back to photography. It almost looks like an old-fashioned photo. A lot of Mark Tansey's work will either be this color scheme or a sort of sepia tone that also looks a lot like a photograph. When we're thinking about that, what we then realize is that he's doing it to trick us. We have an image that partly because of that monochromatic photo-like coloring makes us believe it, at least initially. And then the more we look at it, the more we realize that he is embedded in this interior, a shadow of a person outside in a landscape. You can see the person kind of walking through the reeds. A bricoleur is a person who collects objects from, say, out in the field to bring them home and make art out of them. So basically somebody who is an assemblage or a collage artist is going to harvest a lot of things. And so these are all of the objects that this artist is storing, and his daughter, playing with the flashlight, is casting a shadow that refers to the hunt, going out on safari to find the perfect art supply collage fodder. Why does Mark Tansey want to create a painting that is an illusion, is a lie, but makes us believe it initially? Well, because he wants to get us to be surprised when we discover the landscape hidden in this interior. It's interesting that we will trust photography. You could never submit a painting as evidence in a courtroom, and yet we're going to believe photography, when anybody who's ever worked in a dark room knows that photography is also a lie. And that's before we get into Photoshop and things like that. So here's a good example not only of a monochromatic image, but also of how we want to consider what are the conceptual reasons behind why the artist has chosen to do one of these color harmonies. Another one that we want to have a good definition for is an analogous color harmony. An analogous color harmony is going to be 2 to 5 hue categories that are close to one another on the color wheel. Why do I have to have at least 2? Well, if I only had 1, it would be monochromatic. If I have 6, I'm going to get around to a complement, and then I no longer have closely associated colors. So in this Mark Rothko, we can see that the dominant colors are those yellows, those reds, those oranges, but he does have a sort of greenish tinge here at the bottom. However, that is something that I would still categorize as a yellow-green. It's not all the way to the green, because if he had a green, I wouldn't be able to use this as an example of an analogous color harmony, because that red and the green would be complements. They'd get in a fight. It is interesting to see the way in which he's using that sort of tart, almost acidic yellow-green at the bottom to keep that part of the painting active. I'm mostly going to pay attention to the big red thing in the middle, but that greenish tinge keeps the bottom from feeling like it's just empty or is about to fall off the canvas, similar to the way that whitish yellow at the top is kind of anchoring the top of the image. An analogous color harmony is going to be more variety than you would get in a monochromatic color harmony, but they still are going to be colors that sit well together because they're closely associated on the color wheel. We are still going to describe it as an analogous color harmony. Even if you don't have 5, you could skip a couple. You could have red, orange, and then ignore the red-orange in between on the color wheel, while still having an analogous color harmony. But mostly the idea is that we have closely associated colors with a little bit more variety than we would get in a monochromatic image. A triadic color harmony is 3, that's what the tri means, 3 separate hue categories that are equidistant, that are essentially as far apart from each other as they can get. And while the diagram that I stole off the internet is showing you an orange, purple, green triad, the most common one that we see in modern or contemporary art is going to be the red, yellow, blue primary triad, and that's what we get in this Aaron Douglas image here. What is good about a triad? Well, it's very dynamic. It's very exciting because these are colors that kind of push against each other. And yet I still have a little bit more variety than I would if I had just a complementary color harmony or something like that. In fact, there are a lot of color harmonies. A complementary color harmony is obviously going to be one that involves the 2 complements. It's going to be really dynamic, exciting. You're going to see it on, say, snowboards or things like that, things that are intended to communicate a sense of excitement. We could still have complementary color harmonies that sit quietly, but we'd have to really lower the intensity so that those colors aren't pushing against each other. You could also have what's called a split complementary color harmony, which is where you choose a hue category, and that's your first. And then you get 2 more by going across the color wheel, but instead of choosing the complement, you choose the 2 hue categories on either side of that complement. So it's a split complementary color harmony. You have 3 hue categories, and they're going to have some of the same excitement as a complementary color harmony, but with a little bit more variation. And yet, they aren't going to push against each other quite as much as a complementary color harmony. You could also have a tetradic, or what's called a double complement in our color harmony, which is essentially a split complementary color harmony that swings both ways. So we choose the 4 hue categories that are on either side of two complements. And you can see that after a while, this starts to get pretty silly because we could come up with a name for a bunch of different color harmonies, and probably we aren't going to find very many examples of that. So what we want to do instead of trying to shoehorn artwork into our definitions for color harmonies is look at some works and talk about how artists are using colors to relate to one another and what effect that has both compositionally and conceptually.